My name's David Hutchson, and my father, Russell Teddy Hutchson, was the modeler and master mold maker here at Red Wing Potteries for 38 years. In that capacity, what he did was he would meet with the designers. For example, I'm going to use Charles Murphy for an example. And what Mr. Murphy would do is he would draw up on a sheet of paper what he wanted to have produced. And then he'd meet with my father, and they'd talk about just exactly what that piece was going to look like when it was completed and produced at the potteries. And once that was agreed to, he'd take a solid block of plaster, and from that solid block of plaster, carve out the first original model for the piece that was going to be produced. What do I mean by an original model? I'd like to use the Cowboys over here as an example. Here you see two sets of Cowboys. The two Cowboys at the top are the actual pieces that were produced here at Red Wing Potteries and sold to the general public as wall-hanging figurines. The two Cowboys down below, do you see how much larger they are than the two at the top? That's because you're looking at the original hand-carved models that produced those Cowboys. And they had to be produced that much larger to allow for the shrinkage of the clay when it was going through the firing process to meet the specifications of the designer. My dad was the only modeler. However, in the course of his career, he trained 3 individuals. He trained a gentleman from Germany and one from Holland and another one from the US. I'd like to return to where we were saying that we produced 350 molds that were poured with the liquid clay slip. They produced 350 because they were poured twice a day. They were filled up, poured, let to sit to form the thickness, and then they were dumped out and you had your greenware. They separate it in the afternoon, they made a run, and you'd have approximately 700 pieces of greenware. And they'd make that run for a week to 2 weeks, and then they'd make up the back order or inventory for the pieces that were produced. They never threw away the blocks and cases until the piece was totally brought out of production, never to be produced again, because the liquid clay slip that was poured in the mold deteriorates the mold. And it takes the fine impressions that are produced on that greenware and wears the mold down. So you'd get approximately 250 pours to a mold, and then they'd bring out the blocks and cases again, and then they would make another run. So from 1938, from when they moved from stoneware over to the high china porcelain dinnerware and artware pieces, that clay was all brought in from Georgia and Kentucky and was high-fired china porcelain clay and not the clay that was mined here locally for the stoneware. The two clays were, you could have some pieces of little rock or something in your stoneware clay. You couldn't have that in your mold work. And it was high-fired, and it gave a more sturdier clay when it was fired to your pieces of artware and dinnerware. At its peak, the pottery employed approximately 350 employees, and my father was the last employee to leave the potteries when it went down in 1967.